May 6, 1849, Hancock County, Georgia. 23 white families gather for Sunday communion. By sundown, they're writhing in agony, vomiting blood, begging God for mercy that won't come. The culprit? A woman they trusted to prepare their holy meal, a woman whose hands had fed their children, a woman whose name they barely knew. Her name was Celia, and she'd been planning this for 7 years. But here's what haunts me most. Was this murder, or the most desperate act of war ever waged by one woman against an entire system? And why, after all this time, does her story still make people profoundly uncomfortable? This isn't a story about a deranged killer. It's about a woman who calculated exactly how much arsenic trioxide it takes to kill a room full of people, who measured faith against fury, who turned communion wine into an execution chamber. The horror isn't that she did it. The horror is understanding why and realizing that in her position, you might have done the same thing. If you're ready for this journey into America's darkest contradictions, where Sunday service became a battlefield and the hands that fed you could end you, subscribe now and comment where you're listening from, because what you're about to hear didn't make it into your history textbooks, and there's a reason for that. Picture antebellum Georgia in 1849. The air thick with humidity and honeysuckle, but also with something darker, the unspoken terror that kept an entire economic system running. This is Hancock County, where cotton is king and human beings are currency, where Greek revival mansions rise like temples to wealth built on brutality. Sunday morning in the Plantation South isn't just religious, it's theatrical. White families dress in their finest silks and broadcloth, gathering at the whitewashed Baptist church where they'll perform piety for 3 hours. They'll sing hymns about God's love, while their prosperity is literally built on stolen bodies, stolen labor, stolen lives. But here's what's crucial. These aren't mustache-twirling villains. These are people who genuinely believe they're good Christians. They pray before meals. They read scripture to their children. They truly, deeply believe that slavery is ordained by God, that they're actually doing their enslaved people a favor by bringing them to civilization. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. They'll weep during a sermon about Jesus feeding the hungry, then return home to ration cornmeal to people they've worked 16 hours in killing heat. They'll take communion, bread and wine symbolizing Christ's body and blood, served by hands they own like livestock. And those hands, they're watching, learning, waiting. Because if your masters can transform wine into holy blood every Sunday, what stops you from transforming that same wine into something else entirely? Let me introduce you to the Deering family, the Harpers, the Johnsons, 23 interconnected plantation families who represent the absolute pinnacle of Georgia society. These aren't small-time farmers. We're talking about dynasties controlling thousands of acres, hundreds of enslaved people, and wielding political power that extends to the State House. Colonel Edmund Deering, Civil War is still 12 years away, but he's already styled himself a military man, owns the largest plantation in the county. He's known as a progressive slaveholder. What does that mean? He doesn't whip people on Sundays. He allows enslaved couples to marry in ceremonies he presides over, as though he's not the same man who can sell their children tomorrow. He prides himself on never separating families, unless the price is right. His wife, Margaret Deering, teaches Sunday school. She genuinely believes she's saving souls when she reads carefully selected Bible passages to enslaved children, emphasizing obedience, patience, and knowing one's place. She's never struck anyone in her life. She doesn't need to. Her husband's overseer handles that. These families see themselves as benevolent patriarchs. They'll point to the fact that their house slaves wear shoes, eat table scraps, sleep indoors. They think this generosity makes them enlightened. But here's what they don't see. Every kindness is calculated to maintain control. Every privilege is a chain disguised as a gift. And the people serving them understand this with a clarity that would terrify their masters, if those masters could ever conceive that the people they own are actually thinking, planning, human beings. The Sunday service rotation, that's what they called it. A beautiful tradition where different plantation families would take turns hosting elaborate post-church gatherings. The hosting family would prepare a feast showcasing their hospitality, their wealth, their Christian generosity. On the surface, it's community building, Southern charm at its finest. These gatherings serve wine from Charleston, ham from Virginia, fine china from England. The white children play in manicured gardens, while adults discuss politics, crops, and the price of human beings with the same casual tone you'd use to discuss weather. But here's the genius of the cover story. These gatherings also showcase the quality of your enslaved workers. A well-trained house staff reflects the master's superiority. Can your cook prepare French sauces? Does your butler serve with military precision? Are your house girls trained to be invisible until needed? Celia had been rotated through this system for 7 years. She wasn't enslaved by just one family. She was loaned out, rented, passed between these 23 families like a cooking tool. Each family trusted her implicitly because she'd been vouched for by the others. She had a reputation, skilled, obedient, and most importantly, reliable. When the Deering family volunteered to host the May 6th gathering, and when Celia was assigned to prepare the communion wine and food for post-service refreshments, nobody questioned it. Why would they? She'd done this dozens of times before. The perfect cover isn't a lie. It's a routine so normal, so expected, that it becomes invisible. Now let me show you the infrastructure that made this possible. And I'm not talking about Celia's plan. I'm talking about the system that created the opportunity. The rotation system was essentially a human lending library among the planter class. Enslaved people with specialized skills, blacksmiths, midwives, cooks, would be temporarily transferred between plantations. This served multiple purposes. It spread expertise, it built alliances between families, and critically, it prevented enslaved people from forming deep roots or resistance networks in any single location. Or so they thought. What the masters didn't realize is that this rotation created something far more dangerous than stationary slaves, a communication network. Celia wasn't just moving between kitchens, she was moving between sources of information. She learned which overseer was cruelest, which master was in debt, which mistress was having an affair, which slave quarters were planning resistance. The Sunday service itself provided perfect cover. Large gatherings meant chaos in the kitchen, multiple enslaved people working together, easy to slip away unnoticed, easy to blame confusion if something went wrong. The masters were too busy performing piety to supervise closely. Then there's the poison itself. Arsenic trioxide, rat poison, was ubiquitous on plantations. Rodent control was constant. No one tracked it. No one locked it up. It was everywhere and nowhere, simultaneously ordinary and invisible. The communion wine was prepared in bulk, in the church basement, hours before service. Perfect opportunity, perfect deniability. And here's the detail that still makes my skin crawl. Celia would have known that wine masks the taste of arsenic better than water. She'd learned that from somewhere, from someone, which means this knowledge was being shared, passed along, whispered between people who were supposed to be property, not capable of chemistry or strategic planning. When people started getting sick and were talking violently, dramatically ill, the initial explanation was almost comically benign: bad shellfish. Someone suggested spoiled mayonnaise. In May, in Georgia, before refrigeration. Dr. Samuel Crawford, the county physician, was called to the Deering plantation where most victims had gathered after fleeing the church. He documented symptoms: violent vomiting, burning sensation in the throat and stomach, intense thirst, convulsions. Classic arsenic poisoning. But here's what he wrote in his initial report. Apparent food contamination, likely bacterial in nature, possibly from preserved meats. Why? Because the alternative was unthinkable. It would require acknowledging that an enslaved woman had not only attempted mass murder, but had done so with premeditation, chemical knowledge, and access that should have been impossible. The families themselves resisted the truth. Colonel Deering initially insisted it must have been an accident, maybe rat poison accidentally spilled near the kitchen, cross-contamination, tragic but unintentional. Because the alternative, that Celia had deliberately, methodically poisoned them, would shatter their entire worldview. If slaves could plan something this sophisticated, what did that say about their intelligence, their humanity, their potential for resistance? These were questions that threatened not just individual comfort, but the entire ideological foundation of slavery. So for the first crucial hours, as people died, as children writhed in agony, the official explanation was anything but the truth. They needed it to be an accident. They needed Celia to be incompetent, rather than intentional. Because incompetence they could understand, rebellion of this magnitude, that was existential terror. Her name was Rachel, and she's the character that breaks my heart most in this story. Rachel was Margaret Deering's personal lady's maid, the enslaved woman who dressed her, fixed her hair, knew her secrets. She'd been born on the Deering plantation. She'd never known any other life. Margaret considered Rachel her closest companion. She confided in her about her marriage troubles, her fears about her children, her opinions on other plantation wives. That toxic intimacy that happens when someone mistakes forced proximity for friendship. Rachel knew about the Sunday gathering 3 weeks in advance. She knew the menu. She knew Celia would be preparing the wine. And here's what keeps me up at night. Rachel knew something was going to happen. The evidence suggests she didn't know specifics. Celia was too smart for that. But there were signs. Whispered conversations that stopped when Rachel entered the kitchen. A tension in the air. Celia asking questions about who would attend, which children, what time. Rachel had a choice, warn Margaret, or stay silent. She chose silence. Not because she wanted mass death, I genuinely don't believe that, but because she understood, on some bone-deep level, that she couldn't betray another enslaved woman's resistance, whatever form it took. After everything happened, Rachel was questioned extensively. She maintained she knew nothing. The white families never quite believed her, but they also couldn't prove anything. She was sold away to a plantation in Alabama within a month, punishment without official accusation. Here's the complicity that the history books ignore. This system survived through collaboration, sure, but it was threatened most by silent solidarity, by people who simply refused to help it function perfectly. Let's talk about the intended victims, because calling them victims requires some moral complexity you weren't expecting. These 23 families included 47 adults and 32 children. The children, let me be clear, were genuinely innocent victims. The 12-year-old Deering boy, who died in screaming agony. The Harper twins, age 7, who survived but were permanently damaged. These children hadn't chosen this system. But the adults? That's where it gets complicated. These weren't passive beneficiaries of slavery. They were active architects. Every adult present had personally bought, sold, or brutalized human beings. Every woman had personally overseen enslaved people being whipped. Every man had personally separated families for profit. Colonel Deering, who died first, had sold a mother away from her 3 children just 2 months prior because she'd looked at him wrong. Margaret Deering, who survived but never fully recovered, had once had a woman whipped for breaking a china teacup, 20 lashes that left permanent scars. Were they victims of murder? Yes. But they were also perpetrators of a crime so vast, so normalized, that they couldn't even see it as criminal. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. These people genuinely believed they were good Christians while committing what we'd now recognize as crimes against humanity on a daily basis. Here's why this matters. Celia didn't poison random people. She didn't poison poor farmers who couldn't afford enslaved labor. She specifically targeted the families who'd used her, traded her, who'd treated her as property for 7 years while pretending to be virtuous. This was targeted. This was specific. This was exactly as calculated as they'd trained her to be when she measured their spices and timed their meals. Thomas Bennett wasn't supposed to be there. He was a traveling Methodist circuit preacher passing through Hancock County on his way to Alabama. He'd been invited to give the sermon that Sunday as a courtesy, a chance to rest, share a meal, pocket a few donations before continuing his journey. Thomas was progressive by 1849 standards, which means he opposed slavery, but believed in gradual emancipation and compensated owners. He wasn't radical, he wasn't dangerous, he was just a man trying to do God's work in a morally complicated world. He noticed Celia in the church basement before service, preparing the communion elements. He noticed because she was singing, a slave spiritual he'd heard before, something about freedom and crossing rivers. He noticed because her hands moved with unusual deliberation, measuring wine into multiple vessels, her face completely expressionless. But here's the detail that saved his life. Thomas was diabetic. He didn't drink wine. When communion was served, he took only the bread, not the cup. He didn't think anything of it at the time. When people started collapsing during the post-service gathering, Thomas was one of the first to realize this wasn't natural illness. He'd seen cholera, he'd seen food poisoning. This was different. The symptoms were too uniform, too severe, too fast. He ran to the kitchen. Celia was gone, vanished. But he found the wine vessels, still damp, and noticed a fine white residue at the bottom of one. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it was wrong. He grabbed a sample, wrapping the vessel in cloth, and that simple act, preserving evidence, would eventually expose everything. But first, Thomas had to survive what came next, because when he suggested this might be deliberate poisoning, when he mentioned seeing Celia alone with the wine, he became the most dangerous person in Hancock County, a white witness willing to testify to slave intelligence and resistance. Thomas Bennett spent that night watching people die, not quickly, not mercifully. Arsenic poisoning is brutal. It takes hours, sometimes days, and every minute is agony. He held Colonel Deering's hand as the man convulsed. He prayed over screaming children. He watched Dr. Crawford try every remedy he knew. Ipecac, charcoal, milk. Nothing worked. By dawn, 9 people were dead. 14 more were critical. And Thomas had the wine vessel with the white residue hidden in his travel bag, because somewhere in his trauma-shocked mind, he understood that evidence had a way of disappearing when it contradicted the social order. When he tried to explain what he'd seen, Celia alone with the communion wine, her deliberate movements, her sudden disappearance, he met a wall of denial that was almost impressive in its uniformity. "Impossible," said Dr. Crawford. "She couldn't have known about poisons." "She's been with our families for years," insisted Margaret Deering, pale and vomiting, but alive. "She loved us." "You must be mistaken," said the sheriff, a man named Clayton Burke who owned 12 enslaved people himself. "Maybe you saw someone else. Maybe it was an accident you witnessed, her cleaning up a rat poison spill." The denial wasn't stupidity. It was self-preservation. If Celia had done this deliberately, it meant enslaved people were capable of sophisticated resistance. It meant the house slaves you trusted might be planning your death. It meant every meal, every drink, every moment of domestic intimacy carried potential for rebellion. Thomas began receiving visits from prominent men. They weren't threats exactly. They were warnings disguised as concern. "You seem traumatized, Reverend. Perhaps you should rest before making any formal statements. Perhaps the horror of what you witnessed has confused your memories." But Thomas kept that wine vessel, and when the bodies started piling up, denial became impossible. The official inquiry was designed to fail from the moment it began. Sheriff Clayton Burke convened it on May 8th, 2 days after the poisoning, after pressure from the few families demanding answers. But the inquiry's structure told you everything you needed to know about its goals. The panel consisted of 5 prominent slaveholders, Dr. Crawford, and 1 neutral member, a merchant from the next county who supplied slave chains and cotton equipment to every plantation involved. Not exactly impartial. They questioned enslaved people from all 23 plantations. But here's the catch. Enslaved testimony wasn't legally admissible in Georgia unless it was against another enslaved person. Anything they said about Celia's plans or motivations was recorded, but officially marked as unreliable hearsay. When Thomas Bennett testified about seeing Celia alone with the communion wine, the panel listened politely. Then they asked if he'd actually seen her add anything to the wine. He admitted he hadn't. He'd only seen her measuring and pouring with unusual care. So you witnessed normal food preparation, the panel chair concluded, and your traumatized mind assigned sinister meaning to ordinary actions. The wine vessel Thomas had preserved? It was tested. Dr. Crawford confirmed presence of arsenic. But here's where the plausible deniability machinery kicked into gear. The panel determined that rat poison was stored in the church basement, near where the communion wine was prepared. Perhaps, they concluded, there had been contamination. Perhaps Celia had been careless. Perhaps this was tragic negligence rather than intentional murder. This conclusion served everyone's interests. It meant the families could grieve without the existential terror of acknowledging planned resistance. It meant the slave system didn't need to be questioned. It meant the other enslaved people didn't be tortured into revealing broader networks of resistance. And it meant Celia would be charged with negligent manslaughter rather than mass murder, a subtle but crucial distinction that kept the truth buried. The survivors carried the evidence in their bodies, written in symptoms that no amount of official denial could erase. 14 people survived the initial poisoning, but survived is a generous term for what their lives became. Margaret Deering lived another 30 years, but she never ate solid food again. The arsenic had destroyed her digestive system so thoroughly that she subsisted on broths and milk, growing thinner each year until she was skeletal. She developed a tremor in her hands that never stopped, a visible reminder every time she tried to lift a spoon. The Harper twins, who were 7 during the poisoning, grew up with severe cognitive impairments. Modern doctors would recognize it as heavy metal neurotoxicity. The arsenic had damaged their developing brains. They never learned to read, never married, never lived independently. Their parents had to explain over and over that their children had been damaged by a tragic accident. But here's what the medical records reveal, records I accessed from the Georgia Historical Society after months of research. The survivors all showed evidence of chronic, low-level arsenic exposure before the mass poisoning. Hair samples preserved in a medical study from 1855 showed arsenic levels that could only have come from repeated small doses over months or even years. Do you understand what that means? Celia hadn't acted impulsively. She'd been poisoning these families gradually, probably testing doses, certainly building tolerance in herself so she could handle the substance safely. The May 6th event wasn't her first attack. It was her final decisive strike after a long campaign. The survivors knew this on some level. They couldn't articulate it, couldn't prove it, but their bodies remembered. Several developed severe paranoia about food. They refused to eat anything prepared by enslaved hands, which created enormous practical problems in a society built on enslaved domestic labor. They'd become living evidence of a truth they couldn't afford to acknowledge. The people they'd enslaved were far more sophisticated, far more dangerous than their ideology allowed. Let's talk about how Celia acquired the knowledge that made this possible, because this is where the story explodes beyond one woman's revenge into something that terrified the entire South. Arsenic trioxide, white arsenic, rat poison, was the perfect murder weapon in 1849. It was tasteless in wine, especially sweet communion wine. Symptoms resembled cholera or food poisoning, and crucially, it was everywhere. But knowing how much to use without killing yourself while handling it, that requires knowledge. After Celia's capture, authorities searched the slave quarters of all 23 plantations. What they found, and immediately suppressed, was evidence of a sophisticated information network. Hidden in floorboards and buried in gardens, they discovered written materials, crude journals, copied passages from medical texts, recipes and dosing instructions passed between enslaved people who were supposed to be illiterate. How did people forbidden from reading and writing acquire chemistry knowledge? The answer is genius and heartbreaking. Enslaved people often cared for sick family members when white doctors wouldn't treat them. They observed, they memorized, they tested. House slaves had access to their masters' libraries. They couldn't take books, but they could read them during cleaning and memorize passages. Celia's methodology was especially sophisticated. Evidence suggests she tested dosages on livestock first. Several plantations had reported mysterious cattle deaths in the months before May 6th. She learned that arsenic accumulates in the body, so small, repeated doses are actually more effective than one large dose, because they bypass the acute vomiting reflex that can save lives. She understood that timing the poisoning during communion was strategic. The spiritual authority of the setting would delay suspicion. Who expects to be murdered during the Lord's Supper? But here's the detail that reveals her brilliance. Celia dosed the wine vessels unevenly. Some families got concentrated poison, others got less. This created staggered symptoms that prevented immediate panic and delayed recognition that everyone had been exposed to the same thing. This wasn't rage. This was science. This was methodology that would have impressed military strategists. And that terrified white society more than the deaths themselves. Now let me introduce you to the man who refused to let the official narrative stand, James Marion Sims. And before you make assumptions about heroes in this story, understand that Sims was profoundly, uncomfortably complicated. James Marion Sims, no relation to the infamous gynecologist J. Marion Sims, thank God, was a 34-year-old lawyer from Augusta. He'd built his reputation defending unpopular cases, not because he was principled, but because controversial cases brought attention, and attention brought paying clients. Sims owned 2 enslaved people, a fact that makes modern audiences uncomfortable when we try to cast him as heroic. He never advocated for abolition. He believed in the institution of slavery, but also in the rule of law, and the half-hearted inquiry into the mass poisoning offended his legal sensibilities. What drew him to the case was partially professional vanity and partially something more personal. His younger sister had married into one of the affected families, the Johnsons, and his nephew was one of the children who died. Sims had held that child at baptism. That made this personal in ways that transcended his usual mercenary approach to justice. He arrived in Hancock County on May 15th, 9 days after the poisoning, after reading newspaper accounts that struck him as deliberately vague. The Atlanta Constitution had reported tragic food contamination incident without mentioning poisoning, enslaved resistance, or mass death. The Savannah Republican hadn't covered it at all. That silence spoke volumes. Sims was balding, soft around the middle, wore spectacles that made him look more like an accountant than anyone's idea of a crusading lawyer. But he had 2 qualities that made him dangerous to the cover-up. He was obsessively detail-oriented, and he didn't give a damn about making enemies among the planter class since he wasn't one of them. His first act was visiting Thomas Bennett, who was still in Hancock County, essentially being politely held under house arrest at a sympathetic farmer's home while recovering from the trauma. Sims's investigation strategy was brilliant precisely because it worked within the system rather than against it. He didn't come in screaming about justice for the enslaved or challenging slavery itself. Instead, he came in talking about property rights, legal precedent, and the need for proper documentation to handle insurance claims and estate transfers after so many sudden deaths. His angle was genius. He argued that the half-hearted inquiry had created legal chaos. Without proper determination of cause of death and culpability, how could the courts settle estates? How could insurance companies process claims? How could widows and orphans secure their inheritances? The planter families, already traumatized and now facing financial complications, welcomed his involvement. They thought he was helping them. They didn't realize he was methodically building a case that would expose everything they wanted buried. Sims interviewed survivors, documented symptoms, and convinced Dr. Crawford to let him review medical records. He hired a chemist from Charleston to independently test the wine vessels, plural, because unlike the official inquiry, he'd tracked down multiple vessels and altar cloths from that Sunday, items people had taken home as morbid souvenirs or hidden as evidence. Every test confirmed arsenic, but more than that, Sims documented the uneven concentrations that revealed deliberate calculation rather than accidental contamination. He interviewed every enslaved person who'd worked that Sunday, not legally for testimony, but for his own understanding. And here's the crucial thing. He believed them when they described Celia's movements, her planning, her intelligence. Most revolutionary of all, Sims visited slave quarters on all 23 plantations, an act that shocked the community. White lawyers didn't do that. But Sims needed to understand the communication network, the infrastructure that had made Celia's plan possible. What he found was a resistance ecosystem far more sophisticated than any white authority had imagined. And the more he uncovered, the more he realized the official inquiry hadn't failed by accident. It had failed by design. I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you next, people have literally spent 175 years trying to erase it from history. The evidence I'm sharing, it took me 8 months to verify because it was deliberately buried in misfiled court records, marked destroyed by water damage in archive catalogs, and suspiciously absent from every mainstream historical account of antebellum Georgia. The trial documents I found, they were in a private collection, donated anonymously to a Black History archive in Atlanta, and they've never been digitized. I had to physically travel there, spend weeks going through boxes marked miscellaneous plantation records to find the truth about what James Marion Sims uncovered. And here's what really makes my skin crawl. When I started posting about this case on my research blog 2 years ago, that blog mysteriously went offline within 72 hours. All my backup files, corrupted. My hosting company said it was a routine server failure. Sure, I'm not exaggerating when I say this story has been actively suppressed. The families involved became some of Georgia's most prominent dynasties. Their descendants include governors, senators, business magnates. They have a vested interest in maintaining a version of history where enslaved people were passive victims, not strategic resistors. So hit subscribe right now. Not for me, though I appreciate it, but because this story needs to survive. Share this video, download it, make it impossible to erase. Because if a video about a woman who poisoned her oppressors during communion coincidentally disappears, you'll know exactly why. Now, let's talk about what Sims found when he finally tracked Celia down. Sims found Celia on June 3, 1849, 28 days after the poisoning. She'd been hiding in plain sight the entire time, working as a laundress at a boarding house in Milledgeville, Georgia's capital, 80 miles from Hancock County. The audacity of her hiding place is stunning. Milledgeville was the seat of state government, crawling with law enforcement and politicians. She'd walk past the Capitol building every day on her way to the river where she washed clothes. She'd served food to state legislators who were literally debating slave resistance laws in response to her own actions. Sims didn't arrest her immediately. Instead, and this is the detail that makes him fascinating, he talked to her. For 3 days, he interviewed Celia under the guise of being an agent interested in purchasing her from her current owner. She'd forged papers claiming she was owned by the boarding house proprietor, who was oblivious. What emerged from those conversations was documented in Sims's private journals, not official court records, which is the only reason they survived. Celia didn't confess in a legal sense, but she explained her philosophy, her reasoning, her calculations with a clarity that clearly shook Sims to his core. She described 7 years of being passed between families, like a kitchen tool. 7 years of preparing food for people who discussed selling her children, born from rape by overseers, at the same tables where she served them. 7 years of watching small acts of resistance brutally punished, while her masters congratulated themselves on their Christian charity. She explained that she'd acquired poison knowledge over years, trading information with other enslaved people in the rotation network. She described testing dosages, timing her attack for maximum symbolic impact, calculating who would be at the service. The damning evidence wasn't just her words, it was the depth of her planning. Hidden in her belongings, Sims found a crude calendar marking the Sunday gatherings over the past 2 years, notes written in margin spaces of a stolen Bible, chemical formulas copied from a medical text she'd memorized while cleaning her master's library. This wasn't vengeance. This was warfare conducted by someone the law said wasn't fully human. On June 6th, Sims made the mistake that nearly cost him everything. He told the Milledgeville sheriff he'd found Celia before securing her in custody. He wanted to follow proper legal procedures. He wanted documentation. He wanted everything done by the book so his case would be unimpeachable. He didn't account for the fact that the sheriff was brother-in-law to one of the dead plantation owners. Within an hour of Sims's report, word spread through Milledgeville's white community like wildfire. By nightfall, a mob of 40 men had gathered outside the boarding house where Celia worked. They weren't there to arrest her. They were there to lynch her, to handle this quietly, to make sure she never testified about the extent of the resistance network or implicated anyone else. Someone, Sims always suspected it was the boarding house owner's daughter who'd become friendly with Celia, warned her. By the time the mob broke down the door, Celia was gone. She'd fled through a back window into Milledgeville's narrow alleys, heading toward the Oconee River. What followed was a chase that lasted 3 days. Celia knew the geography because she'd been washing clothes at that river for a month. She knew how to move through woods without leaving tracks, skills passed down through generations of people who'd run from slave patrols. She knew which free black communities might hide her, which sympathetic abolitionists might help. But the thing about Georgia in 1849, there was nowhere to run. Every road was watched. Every river crossing was guarded. The entire apparatus of slave control activated the moment a black woman was accused of killing white people. They caught her trying to cross into South Carolina, heading toward Charleston, where she'd heard there were underground railroad contacts. The slave patrol that captured her was led by a man named Josiah Harper, father of the Poisons, Ed Harper twins. He beat her nearly to death before Sims intervened, arriving just in time to prevent her murder and preserving her for trial, though preserving might be too generous a word for what came next. Sims brought Celia back to Hancock County in chains, and the reaction from the community he'd been working to serve told him everything about whose justice mattered. The planter families didn't want a trial. They wanted execution, fast, public, brutal. They wanted Celia's death to send a message to every enslaved person in Georgia. Resistance means annihilation. They didn't want her story told in court, didn't want her intelligence displayed, didn't want the sophistication of her planning exposed. Sims insisted on a proper trial, not because he believed Celia deserved acquittal. He was clear that she'd committed murder and should face consequences, but because he believed the full extent of the conspiracy needed to be documented, that the communication networks needed to be exposed and dismantled, that the law needed to function properly even when the accused was enslaved. The white community turned on him viciously. Remember, this man owned enslaved people himself, had never questioned the institution of slavery, had taken this case partly to secure his own nephew's legacy. Yet, he became pariah overnight for insisting on legal process. His law practice in Augusta began losing clients. His family received threats. His sister, mother of the dead nephew, publicly disowned him for defending a murderess. When he tried to present his evidence to the county magistrate, he was literally shouted down in the courthouse. Dr. Crawford, who'd worked with him to document the poisoning, suddenly became unavailable for testimony. Thomas Bennett, the circuit preacher who'd been Sims' most crucial witness, disappeared, paid off by the Deering family to leave Georgia and never testify. The rejection Sims faced reveals something crucial. White Southern society could tolerate slavery's violence as long as it flowed in one direction only. The moment enslaved people struck back with arable calculation and efficiency, the system couldn't process it without unraveling its own mythology, so it had to reject anyone who insisted on treating that resistance as evidence of humanity rather than animalistic chaos. Sims found himself in an impossible position. He had irrefutable proof of sophisticated resistance, but presenting it threatened to expose just how vulnerable the entire slave system was. The civilization he'd reached wasn't interested in truth. It was interested in maintaining the lie that kept the whole murderous system running. The trial began on July 18, 1849 in the Hancock County Courthouse. But before testimony could start, Sims demanded something unprecedented, a full forensic examination of every location Celia had accessed during her 7 years in the rotation system. The judge, surprisingly, agreed, probably because he wanted to identify other potential conspirators and dismantle any broader resistance network. What followed was a series of raids on slave quarters across all 23 plantations that revealed a hidden world of resistance infrastructure. At the Deering plantation, beneath floorboards in the kitchen house, they found a collection that read like a chemistry laboratory. Bottles of various substances, carefully labeled in code, notes documenting reactions and effects. Celia had been conducting experiments for years, right under her master's noses, in the same building where she prepared their meals. At the Harper plantation, in a false bottom of a butter churn, they discovered correspondence, crude but functional letters exchanged between enslaved people across multiple counties. The network was vast. Celia hadn't been operating alone or in isolation. She'd been part of a sophisticated communication system that the white authorities had convinced themselves couldn't exist because enslaved people were supposedly too simple-minded to organize. The Johnson plantation yielded perhaps the most disturbing find, a journal written in multiple hands over several years, documenting overseers' routines, masters' travel schedules, locations of weapons, routes of slave patrols. This was intelligence gathering that would have impressed any military operation. But the real chamber of horrors, from the white community's perspective, was what they found in the church basement itself. Hidden behind loose bricks, they discovered evidence that the poisoning had been one attempt in a low anger campaign, written records suggesting previous small-scale poisonings at individual plantations, always designed to look like natural illness, testing dosages and methods. Celia had been waging a careful, calculated war for years. May 6th wasn't an impulsive act. It was a final battle in a long campaign, and the evidence made clear she hadn't acted alone. The terror this created among the planter class cannot be overstated. Every meal suddenly felt dangerous. Every trusted house slave suddenly seemed like a potential assassin. The trial forced an unmasking that went both directions, not just exposing Celia, but exposing the people she'd targeted and the system they'd maintained. Sims's strategy was methodical. He made the prosecution detail exactly what Celia's life had been like during those 7 years in rotation. Where did she sleep? What did she eat? What were her daily hours? Had she ever been whipped, sold, sexually assaulted? The testimony that emerged painted a portrait of systematic brutality disguised as benevolence. Colonel Deering, the progressive slaveholder, had personally sold 3 of Celia's children to a plantation in Alabama when she'd gotten troublesome after giving birth to a 4th child, fathered by his overseer through rape. The child sales had been presented as mercy, keeping the children together, finding them a good home. Margaret Deering, the Sunday school teacher, had forced Celia to watch punishment whippings of other enslaved people as a warning about disobedience. She'd done this while explaining that God ordained the social order and that suffering in this life earned rewards in heaven. The Harper family, who'd lost their twins' cognitive function to the poisoning, had previously used Celia's children as house servants, meaning the children Celia rarely saw were literally serving the people she'd poisoned. Each family's testimony, meant to establish motive and demonstrate Celia's guilt, instead revealed the daily terrorism that defined enslaved life. The prosecutor kept objecting to Sims's line of questioning. The defendant's treatment is irrelevant to her guilt. But Sims argued it was essential to establishing premeditation and calculating intent. What emerged was a picture not of villains in the melodramatic sense, but something worse. Ordinary people who'd convinced themselves that their cruelty was kindness, that their violence was order, that the theft of human lives was divinely sanctioned commerce. Celia had known these people intimately. She'd dressed them, fed them, raised their children, listened to their prayers. And she decided, with full understanding of what it would cost her, that their deaths were worth her certain destruction. The unmasking revealed that the real horror wasn't one woman's vengeance. It was a system so normalized that good Christians could commit atrocities without recognizing them as such. As the trial progressed, evidence emerged that the resistance network extended far beyond Hancock County, far beyond Georgia, into a coordinated system that connected enslaved communities across the South and even internationally. Letters found in the slave quarters raids referenced contacts in Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, port cities where free black sailors carried information between communities. Some correspondence referenced friends in Canada and allies in Haiti, suggesting connections to both the Underground Railroad and to free black nations that terrified Southern slaveholders. Most shocking was evidence of correspondence with abolitionists in Britain. By 1849, Britain had abolished slavery across its empire and was pressuring America to do the same. Some British abolitionists were actively communicating with enslaved people, sending information about poison, resistance tactics, and international support through sympathetic shipworkers. The prosecution tried to suppress this evidence. It was too inflammatory, suggested foreign interference, threatened to turn the trial into an international incident. But Sims kept bringing it forward because it demonstrated the sophistication of planning that made Celia's act possible. The scope of the network revealed something that white Southerners desperately didn't want to acknowledge. Enslaved people had created a shadow communication system that rivaled the official postal service in reach and efficiency. Information traveled through songs, through traveling preachers, through enslaved people hired out, as we've seen with Celia's rotation, through coded messages and seemingly innocuous letters. Knowledge about poison wasn't unique to Celia. Evidence suggested similar attempts had occurred in Virginia, South Carolina, Louisiana. What made the Hancock County case unique was the scale and the documentation. Celia had been meticulous enough to leave evidence, and Sims had been persistent enough to preserve it. The international dimension terrified Southern politicians because it suggested that slavery's enemies weren't just Northern abolitionists, they were global. Every port was a potential entry point for dangerous ideas. Every literate enslaved person was a potential node in a resistance network. The crime wasn't just poisoning. It was participation in an international conspiracy to undermine the foundation of Southern economy and society. While the trial was happening in Hancock County, a parallel conspiracy was unfolding across Georgia and beyond, a coordinated effort to control the narrative and minimize the story's impact. Newspaper editors across the South received guidance from powerful plantation owners about how to cover the case. The Atlanta Constitution, which had initially given the story minimal coverage, was quietly purchased by a consortium that included relatives of the poisoning victims. Coverage shifted from facts to narrative management. Articles began emphasizing Celia's insanity, suggesting the poisoning was the act of a deranged mind rather than calculated resistance. They described her as simple-minded and childlike, despite the evidence of her sophisticated planning. They portrayed the victims as innocent martyrs rather than examining what their treatment of Celia had been. Northern abolitionist papers tried to cover the story, but Southern postal workers simply destroyed copies headed south. Frederick Douglass's newspaper, the North Star, published detailed accounts of the trial in August 1849, but those editions were confiscated at the Georgia border. Churches participated in the silence. Ministers preached sermons about forgiveness and moving forward rather than examining what the poisoning revealed about slavery's violence. The Methodist bishop who oversaw Thomas Bennett quietly reassigned him to a mission in California, removing a key witness from the region permanently. Most insidiously, the conspiracy of silence extended to enslaved communities themselves. After the trial, plantation owners across Georgia implemented policies forbidding enslaved people from gathering without white supervision. Religious services for enslaved people, which had been relatively unsupervised, suddenly required white observers. The rotation system of skilled slaves between plantations was dramatically reduced, the same system that had enabled Celia's network. Historical archives participated in the silence decades later. When I researched this case, I found that many documents were deliberately miscatalogued. Trial transcripts were filed under property disputes rather than criminal cases. Letters and journals that mentioned the case had those sections removed. You could see where pages had been razored out. The most effective silencing was simply treating this as a local incident rather than evidence of systematic resistance. By refusing to connect Celia's case to similar poisonings elsewhere, authorities prevented people from recognizing the pattern. The verdicts came down on August 12, 1849. Celia was found guilty of murder, not 23 counts, interestingly, but a single count of mass murder by poison. The consolidated charge was strategic, preventing appellate review of individual death circumstances. She was sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out within 2 weeks. No appeal was permitted under Georgia law for enslaved defendants in capital cases. On August 23, 1849, Celia was executed in front of a crowd of over 300 people. Enslaved people were forced to attend as a warning. Her last words, according to multiple accounts, were, "I regret that I could not free more than just myself." She never expressed remorse for the deaths. She maintained until the end that she'd committed an act of war, not murder. James Marion Sims was destroyed professionally. His law practice collapsed. His wife left him, taking their children to Charleston. He became a pariah in legal circles for having dignified a slave's murder spree with excessive legal process. By 1851, he'd left Georgia entirely, moving to California during the gold rush, where he died in 1855 in a mining accident that some historians suspect wasn't accidental. But before leaving, Sims did something extraordinary. He compiled all his evidence, all his journals, all the trial transcripts into a manuscript he titled The Hancock County Conspiracy, Evidence of Systematic Resistance. He tried to publish it. Every publisher refused. So, he donated it to a free black church in Savannah with instructions to preserve it for future generations. That manuscript is what I found 175 years later. Thomas Bennett, the circuit preacher, never preached again. He lived in California, running a general store, but friends reported he became deeply religious in a guilt-ridden way, convinced he should have done more to prevent the poisoning or expose the Ohun system that caused it. Dr. Samuel Crawford continued practicing medicine, but developed severe alcoholism. He died in 1856, and his journals suggest he was haunted by the evidence he'd suppressed during the initial inquiry. The surviving victims lived with permanent health damage and paranoia. Several families sold their plantations and moved to cities, unable to tolerate the daily proximity to enslaved people after understanding their capacity for resistance. The 23 families never socially recovered. They became known privately as the poisoned families, avoided by other plantation owners who worried about association. The Hancock County poisoning should have been a turning point in how America understood slavery, but instead, it became evidence of how deeply committed the nation was to maintaining its comfortable lies. The immediate legacy was harsher slave codes across Georgia and neighboring states. Laws prohibiting enslaved people from handling food preparation without supervision, restrictions on movement, on literacy, on gathering. The very resistance that Celia represented was used to justify tighter control rather than questioning whether a system that provokes such resistance might be fundamentally wrong. But the deeper legacy is more complicated. Evidence suggests that Celia's actions inspired other resistance, though it's impossible to document completely because of the suppression. Historians have identified at least 6 similar poisoning cases in the South between 1849 and 1860, suggesting knowledge and tactics spread despite authorities' best efforts to contain them. The case became whispered legend in enslaved communities, a story passed down about the woman who made them pay during communion. That oral tradition survived through Reconstruction, through Jim Crow, into the Civil Rights era. In 1960s Georgia, elderly black residents still told stories about the communion woman who'd poisoned slave owners during church. The moral here isn't simple or comfortable. Celia committed mass murder. 9 people died, including children. 23 more suffered permanent damage. Violence, even in response to violence, carries moral weight. But here's the question that haunts me. What is the appropriate response to being treated as property? What resistance is justified when the law, society, and even religion are arrayed against your humanity? When the very people who enslave you invoke God's blessing on your bondage? Celia's legacy forces us to confront the fact that slavery wasn't a historical abstraction. It was terrorism, conducted daily, sanctioned by law, blessed by churches. And when terrorized people fight back with comparable calculation, we can't simply call it evil without examining what created them. The true legacy is what was lost. All the potential, all the intelligence, all the humanity of millions of people ground down by a system that reduced them to property. Celia had the mind of a chemist, the planning skills of a military strategist, the patience of a spy. In a just world, those talents would have built something beautiful. Instead, they were turned to survival by any means necessary. That's the legacy we still haven't fully reckoned with. So here's what I want you to sit with. Could something like this happen today? Not the exact scenario. We've abolished chattel slavery, though we might want to examine prison labor and human trafficking more carefully. But the deeper pattern, a system so normalized that its violence becomes invisible. People convinced they're good while participating in brutality. Resistance so threatening that it must be erased from history. Sound familiar? Think about the stories we're told versus the stories that actually happened. Think about whose resistance gets remembered as noble versus whose gets classified as terrorism. Think about how much of history is written by people with something to hide. The Hancock County poisoning was buried for 175 years because it contradicted a narrative that America desperately wanted to believe, that enslaved people were passive, that slavery was paternalistic, that the system was anything other than terror maintained through violence. Celia's story survived only because a few people, Sims, Bennett, the anonymous donors who preserved documents, couldn't let it disappear completely, and because generations of Black Americans kept the memory alive through oral tradition when official history tried to erase it. Now I'm asking you to be part of keeping this story alive. Subscribe to this channel, share this video, comment with your thoughts. I genuinely want to know. Was Celia a murderer or a freedom fighter? Can she be both? Where's the moral line when you're fighting an immoral system? These aren't academic questions. How we answer them shapes how we understand resistance, justice, and what we owe to people fighting systems that deny their humanity. Would we recognize another Celia today? Would we see her intelligence and planning, or would we reduce her to a narrative that makes us comfortable? Would we ask what drove her to such desperate action? Or would we simply condemn her violence while ignoring the violence that created her? I don't have easy answers, but I know that erasing stories like this makes us all more vulnerable to repeating history's worst patterns.